Hello, and welcome to our next module for international politics. This week we're going to be dealing with realism. I'm Dr. James Gilly, and I'm going to be your professor for this particular module. So in this module, Module 2, your learning objectives are as follows. First, you should be able to distinguish between various forms of realism. Right? We're going to be dealing with 5 or 6 different types of realism this week, and you're going to need to be able to figure out what each one's all about. Secondly, we're going to want you to be able to explain the realist worldview, right? What does realism look like, right? If you buy into realism as a theory for explaining the world around you, what does that do to you? And on the flip side of that, we also want you to be able to identify the problems of having a realist worldview. So being able to explain the downside to the realism worldview. So realism is a long tradition of understanding how the world around us functions. Realism could probably be said to be the first actual theory of international politics. So the first real flavor of realism we're going to deal with this week is called classical realism. And this is the non-academic version of classical realism. This version of realism really gets its start with 2 places, right? First, from Thucydides in the history of the Peloponnesian War, which is the first real account of human interaction in the ancient world, right, the Greek world, where they actually leave the gods out of it, right? They attempt to explain all of these actions strictly through human interactions. And more specifically, it is most visible through a particular passage in the history of the Peloponnesian War called the Melian Dialogue, which is a conversation between Melos and Athens. And this is a really good way of getting to the roots of what realism is all about. The Melian Dialogue is going to end up being one of your readings for this week, so just keep that in the back of your mind. So for classical realism, it's really concerned with how classical warfare, right, how warfare was conducted back in the day, way back in the day, right, the ancient Greek days. It starts from an assumption that the state of nature of man is inherently evil, right? People are always automatically bad. And that it takes society to mold mankind into acting properly. When it comes to the international system for classical realism, it's a system of all against all, right? Everybody constantly having to fight against everyone, right? The only way you can really help move yourself forward in the international system is through self-help, right? You have to help yourself. Now, Thucydides is not the only author, the only thinker to come up with classical realism during the classical period. Sun Tzu in The Art of War, right, emerged at roughly the same period of time, but in the Far East, right, in China. So we've got these 2 accounts of classical realism that emerged at roughly the same point in history. And they do a very good job of explaining what this classical warfare was like. So this is where realism gets its roots. But we need to move forward into the 20th century to understand how realism has impacted international relations since. So from an academic perspective, classical realism begins with a thinker called Hans Morgenthau, and with his 1948 book, Politics Among Nations. This approach was really a direct response to World War II, right? Trying to understand in a very academic way why World War II happened the way it did, right? Previous academic theories did not really do an adequate job of explaining World War II, right? Particularly the liberal and idealist ways which were in vogue up until World War II can't really explain why World War II happened all that well. So what Morgenthau does is lay out a distinct theory of international politics known as realism. Right? And what you need to think about when we think about realism is a billiard ball world. Right? A world where nation states essentially are these billiard balls, right? They're just big solid state entities bouncing off against one another. So from a strict theoretical perspective, on the right-hand side of this PowerPoint, you see 4 or 5 assumptions that realism makes. First is that there is an anarchic world system. If you'll remember from our last module, anarchy means there's no overarching authority telling people what they can and can't do. Now, what this means for realism is much more the Mad Max kind of world, right? There's no one stopping people from fighting, so they're going to fight. Now, within this world system, the primary actors, or really the only actors, are states, right? States like the United States or France or Russia or China, etc. Those are the only actors, and they're what we call unitary actors, meaning the internal politics do not matter, right? The only thing that matters is that they come up with the same sort of outcomes, right? They function as a billiard ball, essentially, in the international system. It doesn't matter what's going on inside. All that matters is how they bounce up against each other. So the fourth point here is that states seek to increase their own power. All states are supposed to want to increase their own power. That's what they seek. Now, a caveat to this is that in order to make this theory really work, Morgenthau had to include that some states are status quo actors and do not want to increase their own power. Now, if we go back to our what makes a good theory, we see that that makes this theory unfalsifiable and really pokes a lot of holes into what could really be a good theory here. So classical realism has some problems that are eventually going to get built upon. But the final thing you really need to know about classical realism is that it's a state level analysis, right? It's really focused on what's going on in the whole international system, and the chief actor is the state itself, right? So this is a system level analysis with the chief actor being the state, right? So that's classical realism, right? That's the realism that all the rest of them iterate upon. So let's look at some of these other flavors. There's two different flavors of what we're going to call structural realism. Right? There's an offensive version and a defensive version. Let's start with the more widely accepted defensive version first. This is what we call neorealism, and it was created by Kenneth Waltz in 1973. Now, it keeps a lot of the same assumptions as classical realism. Right? It has an anarchic world system. It has states as the primary actors, as unitary actors. But where it differs is that it trades out security for power. Right? It says all states want to increase their own security. Right, so instead of making a bigger sword and going out and forcing people to do what you want them to do, structural neorealism, right? Neorealism is about the shield, about being able to protect yourself from everyone else, about being able to make your own decisions within the international system. So that one change makes neorealism a much more functional theory than a lot of the other versions of realism. And structural realism, and particularly this neo-realist flavor, is fairly widely accepted in academic circles as a pretty good way of looking at the world, at least among the realists. That's kind of the one that most people buy onto. The other version of structural realism is offensive realism, right? It was created by John Mearsheimer in the 1990s. And really what this is taking a lot of the assumptions of structural realism, a lot of the things Ken Waltz is all about, but the way that it gains security is actually by, well, this quote, do unto others before they can do unto you, right? This is about using your power and your security to stop threats before they can ever really become a threat to you. This particular flavor has been adopted by a group called the Blue Team, right? They're usually the group that's anti-China in orientation. The late 1990s saw this become really popular, but since 9/11 and the shift to terrorism as the major focus, offensive realism has lost a lot of its juice. But what it does provide is a really interesting look in at state behavior, right? States' actions having big consequences within the international system. So those are our two structural realist versions here. Our next big flavor of realism, right? The last major flavor of realism we're going to look at is what we call neoclassical realism. And this was created very prominently by Fareed Zakaria, who you might know from his shows on CNN. He's also a very prominent academic in international relations and has done a lot of really good work. What he did is he found that there was a major problem with states as the unitary actor, right? The realism really doesn't do a good job of predicting actions that are not focused on states, right? The big deal here is that terrorism essentially goes entirely unaccounted for within this system, right? It's not something done by states, it's done something to states by non-state actors. So what we see in neoclassical realism is an expansion of who the actors can be, right? We keep anarchy, and we keep this general distrust of this self-help system within it. but we expand actors to individuals and groups within the world system, right? So we're expanding who can be an actor in the system. Uh, so leaders and their different ways that they think about power really matter very heavily to neoclassical realism. This is my favorite flavor of realism. I think that it fixes a lot of the problems that have already come up with realism, which we're going to talk about in a second. But I really think that this approach, if we're going to take a realist approach, is probably the safest bet. Uh, but your mileage may vary. So, what are some of the implications of realism as a theory? Well, I've broken it down into a few different things here, right? So, first is this concern with gains, be they absolute or relative gains, right? The idea of an absolute gain is that you take right into account wherever you started from and wherever you end up, right? That is your absolute gain, where you go from just where you started to where you end up, and that's what you're concerned with, right? You're not really concerned with what everyone else is doing. You're just concerned with yourself, right? So as I like to say, you're going from level 10 to level 30, right? You've leveled up. You're 20 more powerful. Things are looking better for you. Under relative gains, however, you're really concerned with where you sit in comparison to everyone else in the whole system, right? So you went from level 10 to level 30, but everyone else in the system is like at level 37, so you are really paranoid that someone's going to try to come and attack you, right? So you're really concerned about what everyone else is doing. And with realism, the concern is entirely on relative gains, right? Relative gains are all that realists care about, right? So you only care about where you are in position with everyone else, not from where you were in the past. All you care about is what everyone else is doing. So that is kind of our first big implication for realism. Our second big implication is this idea of internal versus external ethics. Right, internally within a country, you can be extremely consensus-based, positive, whatever. Right, but internal politics do not matter for realism. Right, so your internal ethic can be one thing, and your external ethic is always going to be this other thing. It's always going to be concerned with distrust in the international system and concern with other people's actions. Right, so you can see a big dissonance emerge between what you do inside your country and what you do outside your country. So even though you might be this nice lovey-dovey country, you're still seeing everyone else in the entire world as a constant threat. And this can skew the way that you act within the system. So here are some of the consequences of a realist worldview. Right? Being constantly concerned with what other people are planning to do, right? And thinking they're always out to get you can lead to a very paranoid outlook. Right? Right? It can make you really concerned with what other people are doing and really afraid of any sort of action that you see in the international system. This can also impact the way that you build alliances. And we're going to talk about this a little more in later weeks. But right, it can either make you want to gang up to balance your power against other people, or it can make you want to go with the strongest people you can find so you can go and steal power from everyone else, right? Gang up on the little guy and steal what they've got for yourself. Another major consequence for realist worldview is that you are very much always concerned with military and geopolitical power. Other versions of power, economic power, soft power, they don't matter. All that matters is the bombs that you have, the soldiers that you have, and what you can do with them, right? Can you break stuff and kill people? That is what realism is entirely focused on. Right? This is a much more traditional outlook, right, than some of the other theories we're going to look at. So it's a much more conservative way of doing things. Right? Those other aspects of power that we talked about, they only really matter in so much as they can affect your military power. So this leads to some critiques of realism, right? There are different ways to actually use power, right? This is our first critique we're going to bring up, right? There's a great article by an author called Lukes that you might come across, where he talks about three-dimensional power. And in this, power is more than just simply the ability to like punch someone till they do what you want. That's just the very first dimension of power, right? So that is an important aspect of power, right? Punch someone in the face till they do what you want them to do. But there's more levels to that. If you go a level deeper, right, you can actually control power and control what's going on, make people do what you want them to do by only controlling the narrative of how you discuss things, right? You limit what are the actual valid concerns that people are talking about. Right? If you only want people to do one thing and you don't want them to be, to worry about what's going on over here, you restrict the debate to just these issues. That's your second level of power. If you go one level deeper than that, even to third level power, right? You only educate people to begin with about certain things where they're not even they don't even know that this other realm exists, right? So this is just right, one of those power or radical views, right? Radical views of power that right shows some of the flaws with the realist conception. Another big critique is that while anarchy is a good assumption for the world system, right? There is no big single overarching world government. It's possible that the realists misapply it. And this is mostly brought up by constructivists, particularly one called Alexander Wendt. He has a very famous work that we'll come across in a couple of weeks called Anarchy is What You Make of It. Really, this just means that anarchy is a thing that exists, and the way that you use it, the way you think about anarchy, makes it into either something positive or negative. Right? Under anarchy, states can actually work together. Right? States can come together. They're not forced to, but they can come together and build institutions and do all sorts of interesting things, which we'll talk about next week when we deal with, next module when we deal with liberalism. Also, states can be concerned with things other than power, or really even other than traditional military power. Right? Economics is a huge issue. Soft power, cultural power is big. And even more important than that, right, people can be concerned with things that don't have anything to do with power. If you look at a place like Costa Rica or Bhutan, they don't measure power. They don't even measure their GDP. What they measure is gross national happiness. How happy are the people that live in these countries? Right? That's what those states are concerned with. Another kind of methodological critique of realism is it's not exactly consistent, nor is it really accurate. Right? It gives us different observations over and over again, and they're not necessarily very close to what's really going on. So it may be a parsimonious theory, but it's got a lot of problems that go along with it. And one final critique, right, from just observing what's going on, right? Democracies very inherently can have way different goals than autocracies, right? Democracies can care about one thing, autocrats care about something else. And we'll talk about this a bit more under liberalism. All right, there's some significant flaws to realism from both methodology and just plain observation. So keep these in the back of your mind as you're thinking about realism, as you're doing your readings, and as you're seeing realists operate in the world around you. So what are your next steps? Well, obviously you need to do the readings, both from Essentials of International Relations and Essential Readings in World Politics. Go ahead and take the quiz, right? Check what you have seen in the video and in the readings, and just make sure that you've been paying attention pretty well. Then go ahead and do the module assignment. And if you need to, go ahead and post questions or problems to the forum. And then once you're done with all of that, go ahead and move on to Module 3, where we'll talk about liberalism and a different way of dealing with the international society. So again, if you have any problems or questions, go ahead and put them in the forum, and I'm going to attempt to get to them as soon as I possibly can. So thank you for paying attention and doing your work diligently. So go out, do the assignment, and I'll see you for the next module.